the United States, I mean, in the 1930s, the process that gave us the New Deal was a social revolution and a very dramatic one. A lot of policies that benefited the rich at the expense of everyone else were chucked out the window. And for a period of some decades thereafter, up into the beginning of the 1970s, working people had a fairer shake than they'd had in a very long time. So maybe we can contact that again. Maybe we can divine our way to a compromise which will allow working Americans to make a decent living.
Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. Just 2 notes before we get started today. Some of you may not know, I am a professional violinist by trade, and I have just released my debut album, which is actually focused a lot on Celtic folk music and does include some classical as well, and that is called Liminal Paths. And it's a recording that I made with my dear friend, the cellist Natalie Haas, and the excellent Quebecois guitarist Jan Felquet. That is going to be linked in the show notes below. So if you want to check it out on Spotify or Apple Music, I would really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy it. You've been listening to a little bit of it in the introduction to this podcast every time you listen to it. The other note is that this is a fantastic conversation with the always wonderful John Michael Greer. It is a conversation where we delve into politics a little bit, which is usually outside the purview of this podcast. So I wanted to make that clear. Of course, it's right there in the title of his book. It is about politics and the occult. So I think it's important to keep a very open mind when we talk about these things. It can be a difficult subject matter, but I think it's important for us to look at, especially as witches, as practicing sorcerers, or just as people interested in these subjects. And it's always fascinating to hear John Michael Greer's opinions on these things. And I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. So thank you all for joining us. I am happy to introduce our guest, John Michael Greer, who is back on the podcast, and I'm so happy to have him back. He is a very well-known author, writing in a variety of genres and topics, including ecology, politics, Druidry, appropriate technology, divination, and magic. He's written over 50 titles so far. And his most recent book, The King in Orange, The Magical and Occult Roots of Political Power, is the one that we will be discussing here today. He served as the Grand Archdruid of the Ancient Order of Druids in America from 2003 to 2015. His popular blog, The Archdruid Report, began in 2006, and he continues his blog at ecosophia.net, which has a very active following and covers a variety of subjects. So I am very honored to have you again on Coffee and Divination.
Well, thank you for having me on here.
So we are going to discuss this fascinating book, which I was very happy to be able to read recently, The King in Orange. And the title is quite interesting. And I was wondering if we could start with you just giving a little bit of an overview of why the book is titled that for those who may not be familiar with Robert Chambers' works.
There we go. You took the name right out of my mouth. Okay. Everybody knows about H.P. Lovecraft. You mention Lovecraft these days in any context, and people start thinking of tentacles rising from the deep out to get you. And Lovecraft was the most famous, the most colorful, maybe, in terms of his prose, certainly the most adjective-laden of the writers of weird fiction in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There were quite a few others. Robert W. Chambers was one of them, although in his case it was kind of a weird situation. He wrote one very strange collection of stories called The King in Yellow, which is one of the masterpieces of this genre. It has some of the creepiest things ever written. And yet he proceeded to go on from that to write romantic potboilers. He made a brilliantly successful career writing books that nobody remembers these days because they had about the same literary value of a well-written Harlequin romance. But they were very popular and they made him an enormous amount of money. Maybe that was the issue. But The King in Yellow is a collection of short stories. None of them really quite not fit together, and yet they all share common themes. That there is this being, this entity, the king in yellow. What is he? We don't know. Where is he from? Well, there's a place called Carcosa, which is in a reality that is not ours. And in each of the core stories of this anthology, the reality of Carcosa and the presence of the king in yellow start seeping through our world and showing up in various strange ways, and things just get weirder and weirder, and people go crazy and people die. You kind of, again, we're like H.P. Lovecraft here. But during the whole trajectory of the Donald Trump phenomenon, from his descent down the golden escalator, all the way through the present, the thing that has struck me most about it is the extent to which everything has been acting as though something not part of our reality has been seeping through. People have been getting very strange. And people on all sides of the political spectrum have been getting very strange. They've been supporting things they used to reject, rejecting things they used to support, engaging in the weirdest sort of disconnected double talk. And as though, these emanations from Carcosa were seeping into their minds. And so that led me to think of doing a Chambers reference. I had my mind really saturated in the old weird tales while I was working on this and beforehand, because I was doing a lot of fiction that was kind of based on H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos turned upside down. But so it just kind of occurred to me, this is really a king in yellow kind of moment in American history, except yellow, of course, is not the relevant color. So of course it had to be the king in orange.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It was not works that I was familiar with actually before, and I'm looking forward to diving into those. So that is.
Yeah. There's I don't know if you're into weird tales, but they are the stories in The King in Yellow are among the best. Mm-hmm. The first one, The Repairer of Reputations, which is very much it's written by a madman, and it gets weird from there. So have fun.
Yeah. And I appreciate that you wrote this book, obviously, because of the fact that you were looking so deeply into the connection between magic and politics, which have gotten some lip service and some, pop kind of articles in the last few years, as you talk about. And, like serious looks at it, I think are desperately needed. But at the same time, looking at politics and talking about them within a lot of magical communities right now is very polarizing. And some people avoid altogether. So I was just wondering, clearly you've talked a little bit about why you were drawn to this, but why did you dive so deeply into this and feel that you needed to write this book? I'm obviously glad you did.
Well, partly because when people are going crazy, and I don't think that's an exaggeration, when people are going very deeply crazy over a set of weird political events, it can help those, it can help at least some of them to have somebody delineate, okay, this is actually what's going on. It's not, it's not you. And you can sit people down and say, okay, there's a whole other dimension here as to the political life of our time that nobody is talking about. There are actually several layers of things going on here that nobody's talking about. And if we can only talk about them right up front, then a lot of the confusion and a lot of the polarization can go away. This is something I've had the experience of repeatedly in my blogging and things like that. Of course, there are people who don't want to have a conversation. But very often, if you can actually get past the anger, past the polarization, and sit down and talk about personal experience and talk about what's actually going on at a level below the surface, and if you can turn off the media, because they're in the business of maximizing the polarization, and get down to what people are at, what's going on in people's lives, then you can get out of the craziness. You can get out of the polarization. You can actually start dealing with people as human beings again. And again, I've seen this happen many times. It happens on my blog, not always, but often enough that I'm very pleased to kind of foster it and encourage it. And it happens many other venues as well, when people get down past the surface layer. So I felt it was really important to do that, especially because nearly everybody who was talking about the Trump phenomenon and what fed into it and what has come out of it, even those who were discussing it in a magical sense, were doing so in a way that evaded the issues that, to my mind, are far and away the most important, the things we don't talk about, the things we in American society have tabooed talking about that are the dominant factors in our political life right now.
Absolutely. So just to kind of start us off talking about that aspect of things, you speak a lot about class and class distinctions and how a lot is just, as you said, not spoken about in our culture, although, maybe it is getting a little bit more traction these days, a tiny. But if you could just give us in sort of a broad overview, and then we can dive further into it. What is that relationship of class, and how did that relate to Trump? And
okay. Yeah, no, it's very simple. In America today, we love to talk about gender. We love to talk about race. We love to talk about all kinds of other distinctions, but not social class. That's the taboo. And yet it's the most important distinction in our society right now. You can track this by there are various theories of class, and I didn't want to get into those, so I simply proposed a sort of rough outline. You can tell a lot about about what kind of situation somebody is in by talking about where most of their income comes from. Does it come from a salary, a monthly salary with benefits? Does it come from an hourly wage, usually with no benefits? Does it come from a government welfare check? Or does it come from investments? The people who fall into these classes, and we can call them classes, we can talk about the salary class, the wage class, the welfare class, and the investment class. People who belong to each of these classes have a lot of things in common and have had a lot of experiences in common. Now, crucial point number one, your skin color does not determine which of these classes you're in. There are a lot of people in the working class who are people of color. There are a fair number of people in the salary class who are people of color, and down in the welfare class, it's every color known to the human species. It does tend to get a little more lily white up in the investment class simply because they've been around longer, and the invested money generally hangs over from the past when we were a much more segregated society. Mm-hmm. So we've got these four classes. And if you actually look at these classes and then ask one simple question, you can see the thing nobody wants to talk about. How have things gone for each of those classes over the last 50 years? The salary class, about the same as usual. They still have roughly the same lifestyle that people had back in, say, 1971, 50 years ago. The welfare class, same miserable lot as usual. Trudging along with inadequate support and burdened with vast amounts of bureaucratic meddling. Investment class, it's been up and down. Investments don't make what they used to make, but they're still doing fairly well. What about the wage class? That's the hot issue, because over the last 50 years, the wage class in the United States has been destroyed. 50 years ago, one high school graduate with a working class job could support a family of four, could afford a home, could afford a car, could afford 3 square meals a day, could afford health care. I could go on. Everything, all the basics of life, you could cover that on one working class income with a high school education. These days, a working class income with a high school education, you're living on the street. That's an immense change. That's an incredibly powerful change. We're talking about something that has impacted tens of millions of people, driving them down into poverty and misery, and nobody wants to talk about it. It's the most explosive political fact of our time, and nobody wants to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then basically what you're saying about those weird things kind of creeping into the political landscape then came from Trump and other politicians beginning to take notice of this, or taking notice of this, a whole host of things kind of interplaying into the situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, the politics of the last 6 years or so, what happened was that a handful of politicians started noticing that there was a bipartisan consensus. Both parties, both the GOP and the Democrats, were united in one thing: ripping off the wage class to benefit the salary class. Everybody was on board with that. But there were a lot of voters in the wage class. There were a lot of people who were willing to take a chance, even on so improbable a candidate as Donald Trump. Now, I actually lived in flyover country when the 2016 election happened. And I talked to people. I talked to a lot of people who voted for him. The town I lived in, 70% of the voters voted for Donald Trump in that election. And they were saying, look, he may be a complete basket case. He may be a total disaster, but we know one thing. If we vote for Hillary Clinton, we're just going to get the same thing we've gotten for the last 50 years. We're going to be driven further down into poverty, further down into misery, because all she's talking about is more handouts to the middle class. And as for the deplorables, who cares about them? That's all she's saying. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump, he's a wild card. He may be a complete disaster. There's a chance that things might get better if we vote for him. And so they voted for him. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What we have here is tens of millions of Americans in a state of desperation. And the people in the privileged classes, the people in the comfortable classes were perfectly willing to say, oh, yeah, let them starve. Who cares? Mm-hmm. We're the good people. They're the bad people. We're going to call them all racists. We've never talked to them. We wouldn't stoop to go into a working class bar and talk to these people. But we've decided they're all evil racists, and so they should just starve. But they also have votes. And the fact that they were willing to go for a candidate as unlikely as a reality TV star for the president of the United States shows just how radical they're willing to be and just how desperate they are. And I don't know that the people in the political mainstream, what we now call the left, if the people in the mainstream have grasped just how much desperation there is, just how far people will go to get, the kind of lifestyle that their grandparents had in 1971.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you point out obviously that magic in and of itself is kind of, it's intricately tied to power, obviously, and who has it and who doesn't have it, and for those who are the disempowered or they don't have other recourses to feeling like they have agency in a society, they're more likely to turn to magic. I mean,
they're going to turn to magic. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. The golden ages of American magic have always been periods of extreme social disparity between the wealthy and everyone else. The bigger the gap between the well-to-do and everyone else, the more magic is practiced. Look at African American magic as a great example. The two golden ages of hoodoo in American life were during the era of slavery, of course, when African Americans who had been enslaved, what else could they do but turn to magic? It was the one resource they had, and they did fairly well by it. They developed one of the great systems of natural magic that we have today. And then during the period after the Civil War, the period of Reconstruction and so on, hoodoo was a little less popular. It didn't need to be as popular because African Americans had many more rights. They had much more of an opportunity to get involved in society. Then later on, toward the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, you had the era of Jim Crow. You had extreme segregation, and what happened? But hoodoo came back in a big way, and we had a lot of further innovation, a lot of another round of very great magical creativity in the development of these old hoodoo traditions, making them suitable for the modern world. Much of what is now passed on as hoodoo, work, conjure, and so on is a product of that era. Then we had the Civil Rights era, and again, interest tapered off as African Americans got out from under the burdens of segregation. Mm-hmm. Now, we have similar patterns going on in white society in America, by the way, during the first great golden age of American magic within the white community was in the era after the Civil War and before World War II. You had an enormous interest in that, and this was a period, as you'll learn from social history, of incredibly sharp social divide between between, as they said in those days, the classes and the masses, between the well-to-do and the ordinary working people who were being starved, who were forbidden by law to form unions, who were being who worked under sweatshop conditions of starvation wages, and magic was everywhere. After the New Deal came in the 1930s, and especially in the post-war period, you had a period where magic was not so popular because it was fairly easy for people to get by and to thrive without benefit of that. But as American society started seizing up again, getting caught up in the same sort of division between the classes and the masses, between the well-to-do and everyone else, in the 1970s, magic comes back. And we have been through another golden age, one of the great eras of magical creativity in recent period. And what will happen now? Well, that depends on what happens to the distribution of wealth in American society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very important thing for people, especially, involved in magic, because there is so much of our history that has to do with that interplay of power and who has it and who doesn't. And the idea of pitch is kind of the progressive of what is possible for women in a society and things like that. You can look at it from so many different perspectives.
Oh yeah. There's an enormous amount that simply isn't even remembered these days. One of the downsides of the historical mythology of Wicca, which has of course been one of the very popular forms of occult practice in American life since the end of the 1970s. It's very much focused on way back when over there in Europe, and it. Rather than paying attention to, say, America's own magical history. Most people don't know, for example, that most young women in America in the second half of the 19th century practiced divination as a matter of course. If you pick up books of party games for girls, okay, published in 1870, 1880, 1890, they always have methods of divination. Here's how you divine with playing cards. Here's how you divine from dreams, and so on and so on and so on. It was a normal part of daily life for women in the Victorian period to practice divination. Why? Well, we know that they had such severe limits on what they could do otherwise. So of course they turned to magic. You had the New Thought movement. You had a lot of other magical or quasi-magical movements that were mostly among women, precisely because, what other options did they have? 1920 comes along, the 18th Amendment, women get the right to vote, and all of that falls over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was really, I appreciate that you brought that out a lot in the book in terms of looking at the modern, the modern world and where we are at this, but also the necessity of kind of looking at this in a much, much longer context. And not getting, there's a tendency to turn magic into this kind of fantasy fiction LARPing, where, magic means dressing up like Harry Potter and making disdainful remarks about muggles or something. Or, the number of neo-pagan events where you go to, it looks like a Lord of the Rings fanfic convention. And magic is not, unicorns gagging on rainbows. Magic is here and now. Magic is as close as your television, which is beaming spells at you to make you think that consumer products will make you happy. I was just about to ask you a question about and magic. So
let's ask your question. We can go for that.
Well, you speak a little bit about the role of the media in the 2016 election, and you've already basically said part of what my question was since the media is a form of spell work, because it is directing our attention and then our will and intent into the avenues that it wants us to have, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. How do you feel that the media impacted or didn't impact the Trump's win, and then he did not win in 2020?
Okay, the thing to keep in mind is that the mass media is basically cheap, low-grade sorcery. You can't do really subtle magic if you're trying to influence 1 million people at a time. If you're working with yourself, if you're working with someone who's working with you, you can aim your magic very precisely at their needs, their capacities, their internal triggers, and so on. You can be very, very subtle and very successful. If you're trying to convince 1 million people to run out and buy fizzy brown sugar water, you can't do that. You just have to hammer on certain very broad, general buzzwords and emotional and biological triggers. So we have a lot of cheap sorcery out there. One of the things that led up to 2016 is that it is less effective than the salesmen think. There was quite a bit of squalling a little while ago when one of the big corporations, I forget which one, they were in a little bit of financial bind. They eliminated their budget for internet marketing, for internet advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Getting rid of that had no effect on their sales. The advertising industry is, and the main product that the advertising industry sells, of course, is itself, and it sells itself to the corporate purchases of advertising. But it doesn't necessarily work as well as they would like to claim. Now, in 2016, you got to admit, Trump had one enormous ally in this, and that was the Clinton campaign. I've seen presidential elections dating back to 1968. I have never seen a campaign worse run, more incompetently run, more inept in its choice of slogans. Hillary Clinton did a miserably bad job. And the worst thing is that she did exactly the same things back in 2008 when she was running against Barack Obama. She had everything lined up, she thought, but she ran just an incredibly inept campaign, and so she lost. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of what happened in 2016 was precisely the same thing. Against a halfway decent campaigner, Donald Trump would never have won. Mm-hmm. It's been pointed out by a lot of people, and I think quite accurately, that if the Democratic Party had not gimmicked everything to keep Bernie Sanders out of the running, Sanders would have taken the nomination, and Donald Trump would have been a footnote. Sanders would have beaten him hands down, no question. But they didn't. They had their little pet favorite, and so Hillary ran very incompetently and lost. Her media presence was just very poor, and in effect, her sorcerers didn't know how to cast good spells. I mean, I'm with her. Hillary Clinton does not have the kind of charisma to make more than a very small number of people get all warm, fuzzy feeling over, I'm with her. Do you want to be with this person? Whereas Trump was coming out with Make America Great Again, which fed into and drew from the very widespread and very accurate feeling that life in America has become pretty miserable for most people. We have been in a nationwide state of decline for decades. Mm-hmm. Go outside, look at, go downtown, go walk the sidewalks and notice how cracked they are these days. Our infrastructure is falling to bits. There's the whole business that I was mentioning with wage class jobs basically going away and tens of millions of people being driven into poverty. For all the environmental regulation we've got, our environment just gets more and more dirty, more and more polluted, and so on and so on. All of our listeners already know this story. We're a nation in decline, and Trump was saying we don't have to be. We can become great again. We can pull out of this nosedive. That was a powerful spell. I'm with her, not so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, the whatever else may have happened in the 2020 election, and it was a mess. It was a mess on all sides, of course. But whatever else happened, Biden's handlers, I should say, I'm not sure that Joe Biden is doing much of anything, had much of anything to do with it, but Biden's handlers did a better job than Hillary Clinton did of trying to claim the middle ground, trying to say, okay, Trump is this very divisive figure. I will not be a very divisive figure. We need to build bridges. Of course, he threw that out the window as soon as he got in office, but that's standard practice for presidents. But he did a better job of casting a spell. And because Trump had been so divisive, and because Trump had been on the receiving end of 4 years of massive media, negative publicity, negative propaganda, Biden squeaked by a very narrow margin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that what you were saying about the campaign management, which, campaign management, it could also relate to so many other things that are much smaller mm-hmm. than that, also then kind of relates to the point of this, the podcast that I started, which is about mm-hmm. nation, but that's about being able to figure out, I think I have a quote here in my notes, the ways in which the winds of magical change are blowing so that operative mm-hmm. nature and human beings generally can trim their sails accordingly and not mm-hmm. time and effort trying to sail into the teeth of a rising gale, was the quote that mm-hmm. I have in the book. And I think it's kind of showing that, both campaigns is both, it's mundane versus magical. I don't really like using those words, but it's that overview look and that ability to kind of look at the picture.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, the mundane is magical. Magic is everywhere and in all things. It's just that most of us have been taught by our culture not to notice that. And so, there are these. When you're a campaign manager for, you need to have that divinatory capacity to read which way the winds are blowing, which way the public is moving. Are they sufficiently passive and sufficiently uninterested in what's going on that something like "I'm with her" can appeal to enough professional class women who were the main constituencies of that to give you the edge? Or is it a time when change is desperately needed and a lot of people very, very badly want something different from the status quo, in which case "I'm with her" doesn't give them any reason to vote for you? Mm-hmm. That's a divinatory process. I think it might have been very helpful if the people in question had watched the omens or, cast the I Ching or paid attention to astrology or what have you. It might have helped get through the sort of serene conviction on the part of Hillary Clinton's campaign staff and generally on the part of a lot of the American left these days, that of course they're right, and whatever they want is whatever benefits them is the good thing that everyone else should have, and nobody really disagrees with them except for some evil people out there or whatever. This sort of serene cluelessness, this fixation on knowing that you're the good people and that whatever you want is good. It's a very great way to blunder into disasters. Mm-hmm. And one of the virtues of divination is that it can whack you upside the head with a clue by four and say, "No, you're being an idiot. These things that you want are hurting other people, and if you keep doing them, they're going to strike back at you."
Yeah. Listening when the omens do not come back favorably is sometimes not pleasant, but
The thing is, you can accept the unpleasantness of looking at the omens. Here's your tarot spread. There's the 10 of Swords, and you're going, "Oops." Mm-hmm. That's unpleasant. It's much more unpleasant to say, "Oh, that doesn't matter," go blundering straight ahead and get whacked by circumstances.
Yeah.
I'm sure Hillary Clinton found it exceedingly unpleasant on election night to sit there in her hotel room and realize that, she was not going to be the next president of the United States. Mm-hmm. And if she'd done a little divination and she paid a little more attention to something other than herself, then she might not have had that experience.
Yes. And there's a thing, the distinction that you draw. We've talked a little bit about like the magic that is, for people that are in a position where they are disempowered in a society and they mm-hmm. need to use other methods. Mm-hmm. Then you also bring up of course, the people who are in power who would like to maintain that power. And that's, it's not just saying like, "Oh, those people," it's all of us. Like, we have situations in our life that we would like to continue. This is working really well. I would like this to keep going. But that there was a sort of use of positive thinking of, sort of,
yes.
And, like the whole mindfulness meditation craze and what you discussed around that, I found really fascinating. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about that.
Oh, sure. The distinction that I drew in the book is between the magic of the excluded and the magic of the excluders, between the magic of the people who have been shut out of the political process and the magic of those who are doing the shutting out. And one of the interesting things that happens is that in a period when when that division becomes strong, you get more magic on both sides. These days, among the excluders, among the well-to-do, the salary class, the people who are comfortable with the way things are going, there's a lot of magic being done. What is rather jokingly called mindfulness meditation is a great example. In its original form, as part of a particular system of Buddhist training in Southeast Asia, it's an extremely effective system. But in that form, it exists in the context of a whole series of other spiritual practices, modes of study. There's all kinds of things to keep people from just sort of blissing out into the void. what the version of it that was watered down, stripped of its ethical content, stripped of its spiritual content, and mass marketed to people in the United States is better called mindlessness meditation, because your goal is to not respond to your own thoughts. It's just kind of observe them and let them go, so you don't have to think about anything. It's basically a non-chemical tranquilizer, which is why for quite a while their corporations were very heavily pushing it for their employees. So, if you get stressed out because we're demanding absurd amounts of work from you, just meditate. It'll be much easier. And so, but you had that. You had, yes, positive thinking. Barbara Ehrenreich has done an excellent book called Bright-Sighted. And she talks about basically how the epidemic of positive thinking is destroying the United States. Because, positive thinking, what that means is you ignore any negative feedback you might get. Is something going wrong? No, it's not going wrong. Positive thinking, just pretend that everything's okay. And so you've got millions of people insisting that the world is whatever they decide it is. That there is no negative feedback, that whatever they want, the universe is obligated to give to them. The extreme form of this so far, Rhonda Byrne's book, The Secret. Now, I had a ringside seat to that in a certain sense, because when that came out, I was living in a small town in South Oregon, a small, fairly well-to-do town. And it was crowded with people who were deeply into the New Age movement. And they jumped on The Secret as soon as it came out. They loved it. And they all decided they were going to go pile into the real estate market, where they were all going to get rich by flipping houses using the techniques in The Secret. Everybody I know who did that ended up having to declare bankruptcy, and they lost their shorts. Mm-hmm. So, the idea that if you simply believe the universe will give whatever you want is not true. And if you try to live your life that way, you will fail. You will fail repeatedly and miserably. But that's what that was the sort of positive thinking notion that was being pushed so heavily at that time. Because again, if you don't want to notice that your actions and the political policies you support are causing misery and despair to tens of millions of people, positive thinking is a great way to go about it. You can say, well, they just need to have a more positive attitude to the fact that we've taken away their jobs at $15 an hour and given them jobs at $5. Mm-hmm. They just need to have a more positive attitude to the fact that every factory in the state has been moved to Indonesia, and so it becomes a way of trying to evade the consequences of one's actions. And one of the basic rules of divination that I found is that anytime you try to evade the consequences of your own actions, you are going to get whacked upside the head. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a basic divinatory rule. You don't even need to shuffle the cards to find that one out. You just need to be aware of it. And so there's all of this tendency, this sort of, there was The Secret and other forms of positive thinking and mindlessness meditation and the kind of watered down faux shamanism of the Michael Harner variety, and all of these things, the weekend workshop spirituality, things that you can do in breaks in your busy life as a corporate drone. And yeah, it made people feel good. But it didn't actually change anything, and it also left them wide open to the sort of derangement that happens when you've convinced yourself the world must be what you tell it, and the world doesn't have to agree with that.
Which is also all of that. And it's also not taking away the fact that some of those practices, especially, when they were first proposed, had a lot of enormous positive impacts for people.
Oh, yeah.
That can be very exactly what someone needs. And then there are other times when it can just be a Band-Aid over a bullet hole and to do anything.
or worse. When the new thought, when it first came out in the mid to late 19th century, the idea of positive thinking, it was especially widely spread among women who at that time, the cult of the helpless woman was a central part of Victorian gender ideology. Okay, the idea that if you were a woman, you couldn't actually do anything. All you could do is flutter your eyes helplessly and wait for a man to fix things for you. To go to women who had been taught this since girlhood and say, no, you have the power to accomplish your dreams, that was revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
That was amazingly powerful. And when the same thing happened a little later in the African American community, New Thought became extremely popular because, again, African American people have been told, well, you're primitive or all this kind of stupid stuff. And then to have these techniques where you can come to understand, no, I can do anything I want. I can achieve my dreams. I can take action. It was marvelous stuff. But you take these same things and you put them into the hands of people who've been raised to believe in their own privilege, who've been raised with a strong sense of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
They go nuts. Seriously, they become clinical. If you've ever encountered one of these people from a privileged background, and by that I just mean upper middle class, the kind of person who has never actually gone hungry a day in their lives. And you tell them, you can have anything you want. It's not just society, the universe itself. It gets pretty psychotic.
Yeah.
It gets really serious. And if you try to tell them, no, there are limits to this, no, you cannot just flap your arms and fly to the moon or what have you, you get this blank look, the 1,000-mile stare, and then a repetition of slogans, just talking, they say, no, if I believe in myself or what have you. Mm-hmm. It's scary. And the fact that a very large number of the decision makers in our society today, a very large number of the people who have influential positions in politics and business and the nonprofit sector, they've trained themselves in this stuff. They literally cannot hear criticism. They cannot hear the evidence that's telling them that they're wrong, because they can't be wrong, because they believe in themselves. One of the reasons this country is running into one disaster after another is precisely because this plague of positive thinking has fastened its claws into an entire generation of decision makers, and they're making one disastrous decision after another because they cannot hear the warning sirens telling them that they're wrong.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So switching from that to talking about
Go ahead.
The magic that kind of was happening around the time of Trump's campaign. There are a number of, some people may have more or less, like Pepe the Frog and Keck, mm-hmm. what gets are, and some of that. Some of it I knew before, and some of it before I read the book, mm-hmm. I had not even heard of. So I was wondering if you could just kind of tell us a little bit of the story of that magic,
sure.
How that related to
the way that okay, we have to start here with two things that were at the time completely unrelated. The first thing is the chans. So there was originally a Japanese language online message board for discussing anime, which was called Futaba Channel, which for reasons that only make sense if you speak Japanese, came to be called Tuchan. There was an offshoot of that in English language, which was, of course, called 4chan. And it kind of went from there. There has become this sort of broad penumbra of message boards. None of them advertise. Some of them are fairly hard to find unless you know somebody. And they are unmoderated. They are uncensored. They are anything goes. They're places where people who have been excluded from American society, excluded from jobs that mean anything. They've been shut out of the opportunity to start their own lives due to sky-high rents and all these other things. They sit in the basement, in mom's basement next to the washing machine, and they spend their hours online because that's the only thing they've got. And so a lot of them found their way to the chans. So you have this endless rolling conversation of anonymous voices with, posting these comments, each of which is automatically numbered, sequentially numbered, and that's the only identification there is. And this endless conversation, which gets into all kinds of stuff. It's been a major source of internet creativity. If you know what a lolcat is, 4chan invented lolcats. Just an enormous amount of stuff comes out of them, but there's a political subtext. Most of the chans have at least one sub-message board for politically incorrect discussion, and thereby hangs a tail. The other thing that was going on at the same time was the rise of a movement called chaos magic, and that, again, a little history helps here. every so often, about every generation or so, people decide, oh, we're going to come up with a new, modernized system of magic that doesn't have any of these old-fashioned things, blah, blah, blah. And so they come up with the latest version of, as I tend to think of it, magic light. And it's like light beer. Some people like it. I don't. But chaos magic in particular, it's a stripped-down, simplified version of magic. It doesn't involve any kind of work with deities or spirits or anything like that. You're doing it all yourself with sigils, which are basically images and patterns that you can use as a focus for concentration, or hypersigils, which is an image or pattern that can be used by a bunch of people at once. And does it work tolerably well? It has sharp limits because, as usual with these sort of magic light systems, they throw out a lot of stuff that has a lot of value. But that was going, and the chans were going, and what to my wondering eyes should appear but the king in orange descending a golden escalator. Given the attitude of the chans toward jokes and toward raucous humor and making fun of society, again, you're dealing with a situation where the entire tone is set by teenage and 20-something boys. Okay, so their attitude is raucous. Their attitude is rude. The idea of Donald Trump running for president, it was a match made in maybe not heaven, but you get the point. They adopted the Trump campaign early and often, and they proceeded to, as Trump suddenly started moving ahead and breaking free from the pack, and it stopped being a joke. People in the chans started turning to chaos magic because you can learn it fairly quickly, and you can develop hypersigils fairly quickly so that everyone can concentrate on this or that intention. In this case, the intention of getting Trump into the White House. And so there was a lot of it, and that's when things started getting weird. Okay, Pepe. First, we have Pepe the Frog. Pepe the Frog had been adopted as kind of the 4chan mascot because in his original form in the cartoon, he was a slacker. He was just sitting around, not doing much. Feels good, man. And so he kind of appealed to them. Mm-hmm. They started doing memes with Pepe the Frog running as Donald Trump's running mate, or Pepe the Frog with a Donald Trump hairdo, or things like that. So Pepe started getting caught up into this. And then people noticed that those sequential numbers that I mentioned, that each post, there had developed this habit of looking for doubles and triples at the end of the number. So if you had 6468777, that was a get. Mm-hmm. In the slang of the time, that was a trip specifically, and if you got more than that, more than that numbers, that started out as a game. It started turning into a kind of a divination, mm-hmm. And then people started noticing that any post that had to do with Trump was much more likely to get a get, and sometimes a very big get, than anything else. Yeah. And everyone's going, "Whoa, this is cool." And so that was going on. Now, Keck, okay. I think it's World of Warcraft has this, the World of Warcraft game has this glitch where if you go ha 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 into one of the made-up languages, it comes out Keck, Keck, Keck. That's actually how they do laughter in Japanese, or in Korean, by the way. Mm-hmm. Where in Japanese it's fu fu fu. In Korean it's kek kek kek. That's the sound that laughter makes. But so kek had become the term for laughter. Doing it for laughs is doing it for the keks. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then somebody found out that Kek was the name of an Egyptian god, a god with a frog's head, mm-hmm. like Pepe. And they were going, "Oh, this is weird." And it just kind of spiraled from there. More pieces of frog-themed stuff came in. Then, let's see, I think the culmination of the whole thing really was 9/11, September 11th, 2016. Run up to the election, Hillary Clinton's giving a big speech in New York. Now, not everybody, a lot of the people on the chans, I should say, I was lurking on the chans by them because I've been alerted by some of my readers. You need to pay attention to what's going on here. This is weird. So I was, they were saying, okay, we have one goal and one goal only. There were all those rumors that Hillary Clinton was ill. that she had some kind of chronic, incurable illness that she was hiding. And so the goal was to make her collapse in public. There are various versions of it, but people piled on the hypersigils, focusing on this idea of Hillary Clinton just losing it completely and falling to the ground in public. So September 11th, 2016, she gets up on the podium. She gives a speech in which she talked about the chants, and she talked about Pepe the Frog. And of course, everybody in the chants was going, oh. They were delighted by that, of course. They got attention. And then she left the podium and went to get into her van and collapsed. Right there in front of God and everybody. And as you know, the chansters like to say, like a side of beef. It looked more like a sack of potatoes to me, but you know, to each their own. But yeah, she had to be hauled onto the van by her staff as everyone clustered around trying to hide from the cameras. And that same day, in fact, within a fairly short time of that event happening, some other anonymous poster popped up with, "Wow, look what I found." What they found was a forgotten Europop song from the 1980s titled Chatelet, which had on the record front, this is a 45, you know, it has the sort of colored front with the thing, a frog brandishing a magic wand. And the name of the band was P period, E period, P period, E period, Pepe. So people were taking that as, people on the chance took that as a vote of confidence from the god Kek, who was going, okay, yeah, you've done it. The song Chatelet became their anthem, and it just kind of went crazy from there. And so you had, as in the last weeks before the election, you had all of these chansters piling on the chaos magic with the one goal of making Donald Trump win the election. And to the surprise of everyone, Donald Trump won the election. Did their magic have something to do with that? I tend to think so, but it's a complicated question. You know, to what extent was it cause? To what extent was it an effect? You know, there are many complicated things moving through society, moving through the collective unconscious of our time, and you know, one of them gave us 4 very strange years.
And yeah, so I think that's one of the places I wanted to kind of go with that, is that in the book you talk about, connected to all of this, you talk about Jung and his theory of the archetypes. Of course, you just mentioned the collective unconscious and what's causing these things. And I mean, I'm a polytheist, and therefore, while I think of magic as something that, you know, does, of course, it has its mental aspect, its very personal aspect, even its sort of collective unconscious aspect, it's more than just that. There are interactions, you point out, with, you know, non-physical beings, with spirits of some. And as I think you made the point, which I really liked, which was that some of these people that were maybe possibly doing this magic were not aware that there could be larger forces at play. It started, of course, like many things, it starts out as a joke, and then things kind of go differently than the joke was intended. So how do you view that interaction between, like, what the entities are that are kind of underneath this? I mean, you talk about a number of things, like spirits of the land and stuff like that, but I was wondering if you go a little bit into that direction.
Okay. One thing to keep in mind is that Carl Jung was a really interesting cat. There's been a lot of discussion as to whether he was a psychologist who got into occultism, or an occultist who was really good at pretending to do psychology. I tend to think it's the latter. When he talked about the collective unconscious, he was doing it to try to basically make polytheism make sense to people with a materialistic mindset. And so one of the things that he stressed, and this is something that's very difficult for a lot of people these days, because although we are very much in a post-Christian culture these days, there's a lot of traces of sort of popular folk Christianity hardwired into our thinking. And one of them is the notion that God or the gods or the spirits or what have you are good. And good, mind you, meaning like they like us, they love us, they want to pat us on our pointy little heads. One of the things you can learn very usefully from the older mythologies is that that's not necessarily a safe bet. And if you read Greek, the sacred Greek stories, if you read the sacred Norse stories, any other mythology, the gods have their excellence, they have their goodness, but they don't necessarily they don't care about our sense of entitlement.
Mm-hmm.
They won't necessarily do what we want them to do, and they don't particularly care about our feelings. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I think, although as I mentioned, as you pointed out, most of the people in the chants, at least starting out, had no notion that there might have been something moving through the deep places of consciousness, the deep places of the world, that was other than, their own magical work, other than their own hypersigils and so on. But a lot of people on the chants started treating Kek as a real deity, as an actual power who had some goals, some intention, and things. Others didn't, but there was a significant number of people who said, "Oh, we are in touch with something here, and it's something kind of strange." Mm-hmm. And so whatever was going on, whatever power was changing things in the over the 4 years of Trump's administration, and of course still, it's the greatest fallacy, the greatest delusion, I think, of the cultural mainstream is the idea that we can all just go back and pretend that Trump never happened, and that the deplorables can be shoved back in their place, and we can just go on driving the working class into destitution and misery for our own profit, just like before. It's not working too well. I think, among other things, the fact that millions of people are simply quitting the job force. Many of them are working under the table or otherwise finding other ways. But the number of people who have just quit work, who left the job force, they're not willing to put up with it any longer. And our society's lurching and shuddering, and our supply chains are breaking down, and all this kind of stuff. Change is happening. This is one of the reasons that I suggested that the power that is moving through the world right now may be the one that a lot of Native American tribes call the changer, the being who made the world different, and who might make the world different at some point in the future. America had really, certainly the American privileged classes had boxed themselves into this nice little dead end where they were the good people, and they used positive thinking and mindlessness meditation to keep themselves from noticing what they were doing to everyone else in the country. And they were just going to keep on holding on to power permanently, and the deplorables just had to lump it. And that doesn't last for long. Push it long enough, you get scenes like the French Revolution, like the Russian Revolution, the privileged people in the privileged classes being thrown on carts and hauled to a guillotine or what have you. Such things can get very ugly. I am hoping that the presence of the changer, the presence of whatever this transformative entity is that's moving through our collective minds right now, can spare us that kind of thing, can actually force changes short of lining government bureaucrats up against a wall and gunning them down.
Yeah. It could be done in many different ways, and
it could be done in many different ways. And the thing is, we've actually done it as a country several times. The United States, in the 1930s, the process that gave us the New Deal was a social revolution, and a very dramatic one. A lot of policies that benefited the rich at the expense of everyone else were chucked out the window. And for a period of some decades thereafter, up into the beginning of the 1970s, working people had a fairer shake than they'd had in a very long time. So maybe we can contact that again. Maybe we can divine our way to a compromise which will allow working Americans to make a decent living.
Yeah.
And that will force people in the comfortable classes, in the managerial classes, to moderate their desires a little bit and accept the fact that they don't get to have everything their own way. Mm-hmm. But we'll see.
Yeah. And I don't think that we really should discuss a little bit of like the magical kind of blowback after Trump was elected for a lot of people. I know some of them, who, really felt a deep-seated need to do workings that they thought was going to, in some way, either mean that Trump wouldn't become president or derail his presidency, or, and some of them were very, very positively minded in terms of what they wanted that magic to do. But for various reasons that you touch on in the book, it may not have been so effective. That was not following the imperatives of, focus.
The thing that blew me away, not that long ago, most people in the neo-pagan community, most people in the Wiccan scene and so on, knew that you don't do negative magic because you're going to get the blowback from that. You focus on building up the positive. That's how you win. Dion Fortune demonstrated that in her magical workings to defeat the Nazis. She didn't focus on defeating the Nazis. She focused on building up the British national spirit and egregore so that the Nazis couldn't beat it. And the Nazis, who were focusing on negative magic, imploded when the blowback hit them. So, and what happened when the magical resistance, well, first of all, the magical resistance, notice the term, they were taking on a totally negative role, just resisting, not establishing a positive vision and pursuing it, just trying to beat the bad guy. That's a losing hand. That's a loser strategy. And if you do that, you're not going to get anywhere. Mm-hmm. But that's what they did. And to an astonishing extent, they went, people who I had heard not that many years previously saying, Wicca has nothing to do with devil worship. We're literally invoking demons by name. And sending out curses, engaging in malefic magic. And, I don't think we've seen more than a little of the blowback from that, because that kind of thing builds over time. But I think that we're going to see some very, very rough consequences from that. And it's just it's one of those fascinating things. I blogged about when we first started getting these waves of people saying, no, working for justice isn't good enough. We have to curse and hate and dump our rage on these people. I'm going, what are you saying? You used to know better than that. You used to know that doing that guarantees that all that energy is going to land in your life too. But they wouldn't hear it. It was eerie.
Yeah.
I had online debates with people, and they were just going, "No, we have to do this." It was like talking to somebody. I'll show my generation here by saying it's like talking to a Moonie. You get the 1,000-mile stare and the endless repetition of the same talking points. And I really think, something had its claws in them and was not letting go. Mm-hmm. It was scary.
In talking about what comes next and kind of what our potential trajectories for the future are, you've spoken and written a lot about and encouraged people to be more aware of the works of, I think his name is, Oswald Spengler?
Oswald Spengler, yeah.
Yes. And I know that it is too much to try to get too deep into the weeds of that for this discussion, but I think it is important to touch on and his views of the rise and fall of civilizations mm-hmm. and cultures, because that then relates to kind of where we are at and mm-hmm. what we may be expecting.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. The really short elevator pitch version is that Oswald Spengler was a German historian of the early 20th century. He was one of a number of historians who studied the life cycle of civilizations. The idea that civilizations have a predictable life cycle. They rise, they're born, they grow, they mature, they age out, and they die. And they go through certain predictable stages. All of them have an age of reason somewhere there in the middle. All of them, there's certain repetitive patterns that you find over and over again in history. It's never exactly the same, but the broad shape of it follows the same pattern. To the extent that you can look at, for example, the situation now we've been talking about with Donald Trump, and notice that it's basically the same situation as the one that brought Julius Caesar to power in Rome. Again, you have a democratic system, a system of elected officials and so on, that's become completely the captive of the wealthy classes. And you have some very rich guy who figures out he can appeal to the poor and working classes, get their support, and take power with their aid. It's the same story. Similar enough that on my blog, when all this was happening, many of my readers took to calling Trump the Orange Julius.
Yeah, absolutely.
And but yeah, Spengler had very specific things to say about our culture, about the culture of the Western world, what he calls Faustian culture. The culture that emerged in Europe and includes now North America and Australasia, and more or less dominates the planet. It passed its period of growth well over a century ago. Mm-hmm. It has been in a state of decline ever since that time. And even though our technologies have become fancier, technology is it's not a leading indicator, it's a trailing indicator. Technology can continue rising while the society is actually in a steep decline. This is true in Roman times, for example. Their hottest technologies happened when the empire was falling to bits. Didn't save them, won't save us. And so he was talking in quite some detail about, okay, we have gotten past the point at which we should be looking at expansion. We have gotten to the point where we need to look at preserving what we have achieved and getting rid of the things we can't support any longer, because we don't have indefinite resources anymore. We don't have the capacity to just endlessly zoom out to the outer edges of everything, to infinity and beyond. Not an option. Never was. But now it's becoming increasingly clear that we have to think in those terms. And so there's a long conversation to be had about Spengler. There's a form of divination in effect, his approach to history, and generally the approach of the theorists of historical cycles. But as I pointed out with the Orange Julius as an echo of Julius Caesar, we are in a very familiar point in the life cycle of civilizations here in America, in Europe, and generally in what we can call the Western world. And we have passed our creative peak. We have reached the point where it's a matter of, can we stabilize things for the long term and more or less provide, a relatively humane place for people to live who are part of Western civilization? Or do we hit the skids and go down in flames in short order? We have a choice.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And as you said, there's a lot of directions we could go down with that. But I wanted to kind of speak a little bit, because in terms of looking forward and at the same time looking at what is currently missing in perhaps the way that our Faustian culture kind of looks at the world and itself. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that Vine Deloria Jr., who I love his works, and points out how we as, modern Americans have really tried to ignore or wipe out the importance of place. Stories that we tell just in sacredness, but that idea of space and place and the land not being really a thing that we emphasize, something that is a little unique to our current Faustian culture and probably may not survive it. And that also relates to two other terms that you bring up that I thought were really wonderful, and I wanted to have you talk about, which was sobornost. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it.
Sobornost, yeah, you're very close. And tamanos, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Now here we're getting to the speculative end of things. Okay, because now Spengler's idea is that every civilization is ultimately rooted in the area where it came into existence. It can expand beyond that, but it'll never set down deep roots. And so here in the United States, say, there's a case could be made that parts of the eastern seaboard are part of the homeland of Faustian culture. We were settled a long time ago. I'm sitting here in East Providence, Rhode Island, in a place that has had white settlement in it for getting on for 400 years, and you can tell. But you go west, you go over the Appalachians, and you're in a completely different world. a world where Faustian civilization has only put down very temporary roots and where I don't think they're going to last long. So you have this tendency to be linked to the land and this tendency for civilizations that on the same piece of land to echo the same patterns. So looking past the Faustian age, looking past the time where it will make sense to anyone to build skyscrapers and wear the kind of absurd clothes we wear and otherwise ape European fashions. What's in the future? What kind of new great cultures, new civilizations can we expect in time to come? Now, a lot of people for some time now, especially but not only in the occult community, have been looking at Russia. Russia's had, it's had various cultural waves wash across it. It was strongly influenced by the Byzantine Empire. It was strongly influenced, of course, now by Western civilization. But it really isn't part of the Western world. It has its own spirit. And one of the things that that people who know the Russian culture well and who have a sense of where it is and where it's going have been talking about is this concept of sobornost, which is almost impossible to translate into English. One of the reasons I use the Russian word. Sobornost is a sense of identity that unfolds from the group, where the core of your identity is not something individual. The core of your identity is its connection to the land and its connection to the village, to the society, to the traditions. That's the heart of who and what you are. And that's something we in America can't understand at all. Mm-hmm. We can idealize it, but we can't understand it. But that's very deeply rooted in the Russian psyche. And the idea that's been suggested by a number of writers and thinkers for a while now is that that there is a new great culture, a new civilization that will be rising in what's now Russia, probably in the Volga watershed, and that it will have sobornost. It will have this sense of identity as rooted in the collective as its basic keynote. Mm-hmm. Now that's going to be as Faustian civilization goes down, as Europe becomes big. I mean, Europe has acted like it's the center of the world for a long time. It's a little rocky peninsula sticking off the west end of Asia. It's not a big deal for most of human history. It's been a backwater. It will become a backwater again, and as it does so, this rising culture, this future Russian culture of sobornost, may become the dominant force over the whole western end of Eurasia. That's what's been suggested. Occultists who've discussed it have said probably the end of this century is when it'll start building. And of course, it'll take many centuries to rise to power and to express its own vision of humanity. Now, here in the United States, we do not speak that language. We do not have the sobornost is not an American concept. If you reach down into the heart of an American psyche, you do not find a connection to the village, to the traditions. You find something very uniquely individual. That's one of the things that makes us so weird by the standards of everything in the old world. And so the idea that I'm suggesting, because again, occultists have been saying that probably somewhere around 2600, there will be the rise of a new great civilization in North America. And my suggestion, my hypothesis, if you will, is that civilization will have as its keynote a concept which I borrowed from the Chinook jargon, which is the old trade language of native North America and Western native North America, a language that was once spoken from California to Alaska and from the Pacific coast inland to the edge of the Great Plains. And the word is Tamanuus. The Tamanuus is your guardian spirit. It is your luck. It is your talent. It is the thing, the connection with the spiritual world that makes you absolutely individual. And that's what's at the heart of the American psyche, a link to something unique in the spiritual realm. When you have American Christians, unlike Christians anywhere else, they're meeting in a community, they're meeting in church, they are part of the universal body of Christ. In America, you're establishing a relationship with Jesus as your personal savior. It's all got to be personal. It's all got to be that one-on-one connection between you and the root of your being. And so it makes for a very different psyche, a very different way of looking at the world. It's something we can see a lot of expressions in Native American cultures where, for example, in many Native American cultures, the basic act of spiritual maturity was the vision quest, where you go off on your own into the wilderness somewhere and you seek a vision, which will be uniquely yours, which nobody else in the world will have. And that vision will be the guiding star for your life. And that's one expression. I think there are many others, but America has, from as far back as we know, it's the kind of place where individuals stand out, where individuals go off on their own strange quests, sometime to disaster, sometime to miracle. One of the figures that I've liked to cite here as an example is Johnny Appleseed, John Chapman, who some of our listeners may not realize he was a real person, but he was a missionary of the Swedenborgian Church, and that would take us into really strange territory. But he figured out how to make his living and get by and pursue his vision, planting apples all over the Midwest. Inventing his own industry, inventing his own life, inventing himself as something wholly new. And that's a very American thing to do. And it's not something that makes any sense to any other culture, but it's kind of what we are. And I think that's my hypothesis is that that's going to be the keynote of the great civilization that will rise here after 2600.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it may be a very slow or strange process.
It always is.
I think that, yeah.
Yeah. If you look at the process by which any civilization rises, any civilization is born, it's always weird. It always draws on the relics of older civilizations, and then just strange things happen, and it doesn't make sense to anybody else. Mm-hmm. The Faustian civilization. I mean, we're the Faustian civilization, the only culture in world history to use linear perspective in its art. At the center of the Faustian vision is this idea of journey into infinite distance, the straight line going whoosh off to forever. That's at the heart of our psychic vision within Faustian culture. Thus, of course, we were the people who developed the really good long-distance sailing and circumnavigated the globe. Of course, we were the culture to create rockets and actually get into outer space, because that's our vision. There's lots of things other cultures have been much better at that we're lousy at, but overcoming distance, that's what we do.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's also that, like, the idea that other ways of being could continue to exist in the face of, what our dominant culture says should be the only way, the best way. We have, where we live in Vermont here, some of our neighbors are Amish. They have moved to Vermont, just so happens to be our town. And so some of them are friends of ours. And I was talking to another non-Amish friend of mine. And, I have since learned that was expected. The Amish way of life was expected any day now to go extinct. That was supposed to.
Because of course, the modern Faustian way of life is the only right way for people to live. The Amish will be around long after Faustian civilization is pushing up daisies in the graveyard of dead civilizations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I just really, I think that is very important. And I think it is part of the piece that people are missing, is that relationship of the land and the fact that it is more than just us at play here, that there could be other forces. I think it's like Gordon White sometimes says, like, thoughts have people, not just people having thoughts.
Yeah. That's funny, because one of my teachers used to say, you always need to be careful. Do you have your thoughts, or do your thoughts have you?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's important, because a lot of times people they think, very often when people insist they're being most original and most cutting edge, they're rehashing something that they got from the collective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I hate to think of this ending, because it is so fascinating, but I wanted to just kind of circle to a question that I think would be really helpful for people, to which myself, I have my own thoughts on this, but I wanted to know what advice you would give people about interacting with the kind of crazy cultural discourses we have right now. And some of it can be very damaging, I think, mentally for people. obviously just the way our culture and our media frames things and pits people against each other. How are you trying to, you obviously look at these things very closely and write and, talk to people about them all the time. How do you think about it in such a way that you stay balanced and it doesn't overwhelm you?
Okay. The first thing to do is decrease your exposure to the corporate media. Because at this point, the corporate media is pushing destructive magic on you. They're doing it night and day. They are pushing spells that benefit the existing order at your expense. Take the single most useful thing you can do if you still have one of these misbegotten things in your house, take your television, unplug it, and drop it in the dumpster. If you can drop it from a couple of stories high and watch it implode, that's especially fun. Get rid of it. Seriously, there's a reason they call what's on it programming. You don't need that garbage in your mind. But yeah, start by getting rid of your television and getting a good ad blocker on the internet, and then spending less time on the internet than you otherwise would. You don't need to keep your mind tied in that tightly to the collective consciousness when the collective consciousness is heading into gibbering insanity. You need distance. Okay. Get the books that you like, especially consider reading books that were written before you were born. That's a shock for most people because it's a really sharp confrontation with people who think differently than they do. That's a shock you need to have because the world is not just the way your mind formulates it. But, try making that shift toward media, toward forms of entertainment to the extent that you need entertainment. That don't draw on contemporary collective culture, that are not part of the current craziness. If you've been around for a few years, go look at some of the books you enjoyed 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Tap back into the things that actually mean something for you personally. And then as you get your mind clear, start very quietly looking around, both online and in person, other people who share your interests, other people who share your concerns. One of the things that's happening right now as this sort of collective structure of sorcery breaks down is people are starting to gather. People are starting to form these first tentative networks that will become the social networks of the future. And any effort in that direction is likely to be very helpful, making contact with other human beings and making human contact, not just exchanging sound bites, but actually sharing thoughts and ideas and dreams and hopes. And not expecting everyone to listen to you. That's a Faustian thing, by the way. The Faustian idea is your ego is standing there in the midst of an adoring audience who are listening to everything you say and never answering back. I think that was probably the state of consciousness that got Hillary Clinton was in when she chose I'm with her. But don't go there. It's not a constructive place to be. It's not going to help. It won't work. Conversation, that means learning to listen, by the way. And so distance yourself from the corporate media, begin tentatively and carefully making contact with other people, and also look through your own life and see where you are vulnerable to disruptions in things like supply chains and so on, and fix those as much as possible. Have a little more food in the cupboard. Make sure you have backups for any important systems that you really need to have, all this kind of stuff. We're moving into a period of potentially fairly serious disruption. And if you have things in place that you can weather that a little more easily, you'll be better off.
No, that's really beautiful. And I think so much that can be done just with all of those things in mind. That's a lifetime worth. So
well, yeah, the thing, and the really useful thing to keep in mind is that you just have to take this a day at a time.
Yeah.
You don't have to make a running leap into some kind of imaginary future. We are all on our way into the future at a rate of 60 minutes every hour. And we just take it a step at a time, do what you can, and use divination. And keep up your spiritual practices also, because that's a very important resource, a resource that most societies have used in hard times like these with very good results. So worth doing.
Thank you. I wanted to just have you tell people if they are curious to find you and want to know more about your blogs. I mentioned them briefly, but can you just tell
Sure. Okay. To get it, to watch me to follow me online, ecosophia.net, ECOSOPHIA.net is my main blog. I also have a presence on dreamwidth.org. That's ecosophia@dreamwidth.org. Or ecosophia.dreamwidth.org. It's not at. If you use bookshop.org for your book shopping, which I highly recommend. John Michael Greer, I believe, is the title. It may be JMG, but if you look up my name on bookshop.org, you'll find my shop, and you find most of my books.
Wonderful, and I will have all of that in the show notes for people to be able to click on. But just
excellent, thank you.
And yeah, I am really excited for all the works that I know you're constantly working on things. So I know that.
Oh yeah. Oh, I've got a bunch of stuff en route.
All right. That is wonderful, and I can't wait to hopefully have you back on to talk about those.
I will look forward to it.
All right. Well, thank you again, and this has been really lovely.
Thank you. I've enjoyed being on.
A fascinating conversation, as I expected it to be. I highly recommend sitting down and reading through The King in Orange. It is a challenging and excellent book. It is something that I think will spur some very interesting conversations, and I am looking forward to talking about this interview and about various opinions on these matters with my friends and my spiritual coven mates. And I think that these conversations are important to have, challenging though they can be. It is in that challenge and in those respectful conversations that we can get to more knowledge and more understanding of our own opinions and our own positions. As always, links are in the show notes below. And thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast and check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. May we have excellent conversations, and may we enjoy our journeys with divination. Until I see you next time.
How long was the earth?